This is the Unit 1 overview lecture. I'm going to be going over some of the most important concepts for the first 4 chapters, and make sure to read your textbook and always go through everything on the videos in the textbook chapters. That way you make sure that you're not missing anything, because there are some topics that I will not be able to cover in these videos. So we'll start with chapter 1. The first topic we'll kind of get into is nature versus nurture. This is basically the idea of the nature side being biology and genetics, and then the nurture side is things that are environmental. Things like your family structure, where you live, your socioeconomic status, parenting styles, things like that. So nature is all about the biology, and the nurture is all about the environment. And the debate between these two is which really influences development more. Is one stronger than the other? We've basically come to understand that they both have strong influences and that they really work together and influence each other. And then Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems, there's a diagram on page 16. Just make sure that you understand the difference between all of these different systems that Bronfenbrenner described. One of the questions asks you to give examples, so make sure you're giving examples for each of these systems. So a microsystem is a small system that is directly influencing an individual. So this would be something like your family is a microsystem. Then an exosystem is kind of the next layer out, which does influence a person, but not directly. So I like to use the example of a parent's workplace for a child being an exosystem. So the child doesn't actually go to work with the parent, but a lot of the things that happen at the parent's workplace will indirectly affect the child. Things like health insurance benefits. That's not something that the child actually deals with or sees or uses on a regular basis, but it does influence them in their health care. Then a macro system is on a bigger scale. This would be something like your culture. So living in America, American culture would be a macro system, or any country for that matter. Then a chronos system is the time period. It changes over time. So a chronos system, an example might be growing up in the Great Depression versus growing up now. The changes over time. And then a mesosystem isn't really a system. It is just the interaction between two other systems. So say your parents go to a parent-teacher conference at school. That's two microsystems, the parents and the school, that are interacting with each other. So that's Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems. There will be some questions about that, so make sure you understand that systems theory. We'll move on to scientific method. This is basically just the steps that a researcher would go through when they are studying something. So the steps are, first it starts with a question. Basically, you're just curious about something or you have a question. Then next is the hypothesis. And this is important for you guys to understand what a hypothesis is. It's a specific prediction. So this would be a statement. It's a guess about what specifically the researcher thinks is going to happen when they're doing their study. So when they set out with their question, they are giving a prediction of what they think the answer will be. And it's pretty specific to their whatever they're studying. So this is going to be a very specific statement about what they think is going to happen in their specific experiment or whatever they're studying. Then testing, this is the actual thing of gathering the data, figuring out what happens when we do this, or watching something and recording how things change. And then we draw the conclusions, which is where we see, was the hypothesis correct or was it not? And then we report the results. So that's the scientific method. And the next one is research methods. So since they both have the word method, that can be a little confusing. But a lot of the questions we'll ask for Unit 1, what was the method that someone used when they were studying something? So when we're talking about method, it's usually talking about research methods. And it's going to be one of these three, either observation, experiment, or survey. Those are the three research methods. And then within those research methods, your data can be either quantitative or qualitative, or cross-sectional or longitudinal. So these are kind of like descriptors of the three main research methods. So observation is when a researcher is just watching someone or something in its natural environment. It can also be in a laboratory, but it's with the least amount of interference by the researcher. So they're not going to be introducing any variables. They're not going to be changing anything. They're just watching and recording what happens. As soon as they introduce a variable where they maybe do one thing to one group and something else to a different group, that automatically changes it to an experiment. It is no longer an observation if the researcher interferes in any way. So an experiment is when you take the two groups, you do one treatment to one group and another treatment to another group, and then you see what the differences are. So experiment involves variables, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And then the last research method is survey. That's basically just a questionnaire, asking someone their opinion on something or how their experience was. So any of these three methods could be cross-sectional or longitudinal. Cross-sectional just means it's happening once. So if you're wanting to compare two groups of people, you're just doing it one time. So you're going to compare this group with this group. But longitudinal compares the same group of people over a long period of time. So say you want to study this group of kindergartners and see what changes they make over the years of elementary school. So you would go back and visit them every year that they're in elementary school. So you're going to compare how they were in kindergarten versus how they are then in 5th grade. That would be longitudinal. So a cross-sectional version of that would be to take a kindergarten class and a 5th grade class and just compare them with each other done at the same time. And then quantitative and qualitative is what the data can be. So quantitative just means it has a number assigned to it, that like quantity, that's how I remember it. So that would be like an IQ score or something that has a number assigned to it. And then qualitative does not have a number. So that's more like qualities. So someone's ideas or their behavior or something like that that does not have a number. So I want to explain the differences of the variables. There's going to be some questions about this, and this is something that tends to trip people up. A variable is anything that can affect the outcome of your research. So it could be someone's age or their gender, which might not be the thing that you're actually manipulating in an experiment, but it can still have an effect on how things turn out. Girls might do differently in the experiment than boys do, but that might not be the actual thing that you're studying. But it's just something that can affect the research. And then a special treatment is a variable where the researcher is specifically going to test that treatment to see if it makes a difference. So that's the independent variable. The independent variable is what is being changed. So you're going to watch some videos about some experiments in this unit. There's one for the observation assignment that is about this classroom. Miss Elliott is the teacher, and she decides that she's going to change this variable and treat one group of kids differently than the other group is treated. That is the independent variable, is how they're being treated. Then the dependent variable is the result. And how I remember this is that it depends on the independent variable. So whatever the result is of what was changed, that's the dependent variable. So the kids that were treated differently, how did they respond, or how did they do on the test, or what did they act like? That's going to be the dependent variable. Okay, then we'll move on to chapter 2. This chapter has a lot of information in it, and I have posted some more specific videos on the chapter 1 or the unit 1 notes from instructor page, so that we can get into a lot more detail in those videos. But here I'm just going to do a basic overview of theories. So a theory is just someone's idea, a possible explanation for behavior or for development or something like that. So it's not to say that this theory is wrong and this theory is right, or, you know, they're not black and white like that. It's more of like, this theory has some good ideas that fit well for explaining this type of development, and then this theory works for something else. So we can kind of use different parts of different theories to explain different things as far as development and behavior goes. You don't necessarily have to agree with every theory. It's not to say that this theory is correct all of the time, but it just kind of helps to guide how we kind of try to figure things out. So the first one is Freud, which is part of the psychoanalytic theory, and this is the one that people have the most issue with. A lot of people don't agree with Freud, and that's fine. You don't have to agree with Freud. You just have to understand what Freud said and how he thought. So we need to understand his theory even if we don't agree with it. It's the psychosexual theory, which a lot of the focus is on the inner drives and fixations, and his stages were oral, anal, and phallic. Like I said, not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but there is another video posted that does go into much more detail. The next, psychoanalytics, these are similar because Erikson was a follower of Freud, so they both fall into the psychoanalytic category. So Erikson focused more on the social aspect rather than the sexual aspect. So Erikson was focusing on there was a crisis between two opposing forces, and his stages went through the whole lifespan. So there are 8 stages on Erikson's. There's a chart on page 41 that describes all of the different stages, but basically there are 2 opposing forces. Like the first one is trust versus mistrust, and that's the baby stage. And so the baby is trying to gain trust over mistrust during that stage of life. And then it goes through all the way through adulthood on Erikson. So make sure to watch that video for more details on his theory. Then the next one is behaviorism. This would be Watson, Skinner, and Pavlov. This one is all about environment. It's basically whatever outside forces are kind of controlling how we make our decisions. So it's conditioning, rewards, punishment, reinforcers. So the difference between classical and operant conditioning, you'll need to know that. So classical conditioning is when a neutral stimulus is tied to a meaningful stimulus. So this would be the Pavlov's dogs, when Pavlov would ring a bell when the food was being presented. So then the dogs began to associate a bell with food, which the bell has nothing to do with the food, but he made it be tied to it. So then every time the dogs would hear the bell, they would start to salivate because they would start to associate it with food, even if the food wasn't present. And then operant conditioning is when an action is followed by a reward or punishment. So in operant conditioning, the action has to come first, and then it's either reinforced positively or negatively. The next major theory is cognitive theory, which is Piaget. There's a chart on page 47 that describes all of his different stages. Piaget basically focused a lot on the cognitive development and how the brain matures and the different thought processes that children go through as they develop. And he has 4 major stages, which are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. In the sensory motor, this is the infancy stage. This is all just about the senses and the motor skills. That's why sensory motor. This is why babies would put everything in their mouth, because it's all focused on their senses. And that's how they're learning about their world. Then pre-operational is the next stage. It's a very egocentric kind of stage where the young children are only able to see things through their own perspective. It doesn't mean they're selfish necessarily. It just means they can't understand what someone else is thinking or something that they haven't seen. They can't understand some abstract ideas. Then concrete operational is a little more logical. They can understand things like conservation, like those experiments you'll see in the videos. You'll know what I'm talking about when you watch, where they're pouring water into different size glasses, and then they're able to say whether it's more or less or the same. So it's much more logical, but it's still based on what they can actually see or touch or what they have experienced themselves. And then finally, the formal operational gets into the more abstract thought, hypothetical situations where people can understand things that are not physically concrete in front of them, but more of an abstract idea. The next main theory is sociocultural, and this is Vygotsky. And Vygotsky was all about social learning, learning by watching someone, learning in a more social atmosphere where there are mentors or someone's guiding you through a process. The zone of proximal development is one of Vygotsky's big ideas, which is basically just, that's the ZPD that you see right there, zone of proximal development. It means that what a person is capable of right now, and then there's this zone which is just a little bit beyond what they could understand by themselves. So if you have someone that's more experienced, they can work within that ZPD to get them to bump up to that next level of what is just beyond their grasp of understanding if they were doing it by themselves. So this is about guiding someone, helping someone based on your experiences. The next theory is universal. This is kind of the idea that all humans have the same basic needs, that humans are more alike than they are different. And this is Maslow, which he has this kind of triangle hierarchy chart on page 54. And the needs go from the bottom, which is physiological, all the way up to the top, which is self-actualization. And the idea is that you can't move to the next level unless you have that need met. So the bottom would be things like food and water. So you can't move on to the next level until you know you have those physiological needs met. So just make sure to look at that chart on page 54 for all of Maslow's ideas. And again, please watch the specific theory video so that you can see more detail on all of these different theories. These are things that you're going to need to know for the entire semester. We're going to keep coming back to these ideas. We're going to be talking about these theories for the whole semester. So just make sure that you read your chapter, watch those other videos, and that you really understand the differences between all these theories. Now, moving on to chapters 3 and 4, there's not quite as much information in these. Chapter 3 is about genetics, all the DNA patterns and things like that. I wanted to talk about question 11. It asks you to put in order from like smallest to largest, all these different little things, gene, DNA, allele, genome, stuff like that. The textbook is not very clear on the order of that. It's kind of a tricky question. So on question 11, just read through that section. Do your best to put them in order, but don't stress over it. If I'm not going to count off if you don't get it exactly right. You can Google it. You can just write them down in the order that they appear in the textbook. It's really not that important to know the order from smallest to largest. So just do your best on question 11, and as long as you have something that makes some kind of sense, you'll be fine. You'll get credit for that one. Okay, then we'll talk about the idea of epigenetics. Genetics is, your DNA, something that's been inherited. And then the epigenetics is saying that things in the environment can affect your genes and how they are expressed. So this is back to that idea of nature versus nurture, and that they are interacting with each other. So you might have a gene for something, but it has to be turned on by something in the environment. So one of the examples in the questions is like alcoholism. So you might have a gene that predisposes you to alcoholism, but if you never are around alcohol or don't ever drink alcohol, then that gene will never be expressed. So that's the idea of epigenetics, is that the environment influences which genes actually show up. And we'll talk more about that in the genotype versus phenotype. Next is gene patterns. There's additive, dominant recessive, and X-linked. So you need to know the difference of these three different gene patterns and kind of what each one does. There'll be a question about which characteristic is which pattern. So additive is when the two are kind of mixed together. So say you've got a mom with black hair and a dad with blonde hair, and then the baby has brown hair. So that's additive because the two genes are just adding together. Then dominant recessive is where either one or the other is going to express. So like eye color is dominant recessive because brown is dominant, blue is recessive. So in order to get a blue eye, you have to have the two recessive genes. And then X-linked is the one that is carried through the mother's chromosomes, and there's nothing on the Y chromosome to counteract that, so the X-linked is always going to show up in boys because the boys have the Y. So it's carried on the mom, but it shows up in boys. So read a little more in that section about the X-linked, but things like color blindness is why more men are colorblind than women, because the men have a Y chromosome and there's nothing to counteract that gene that is carried on the X. that goes into the Y. Hopefully that makes sense, but it's described better in your textbook. Okay, then genotype versus phenotype. The genotype is the actual DNA, that is your genes, and then the phenotype is how things are expressed. So like we were talking about hair color, your hair color would be the phenotype, and then the genotype would be the actual DNA sequence that created that. So your phenotype is a mixture of all of your genes plus whatever environmental factors have gone into it. So when we talked about the example of alcoholism, the genotype could be that you have that predisposition in your genes to be alcoholic, but the phenotype is whether you have actually inherited the alcoholism. So again, if you never drink alcohol, then you won't have that phenotype, even though it's on your genes. And then 84 and 85, there's a chart that talks about all the different gene disorders. There will be a question about that, so just take a look at those gene disorders and all the different characteristics of them. And then the next topic in Chapter 3 is about genetic testing and counseling. So this is kind of a controversial issue as far as should people get genetic testing or should they not. There's definitely pros and cons on both sides of this issue. So when you're answering questions about the genetic testing and counseling, just make sure that you are supporting what you're saying by things that you've seen in the videos or things that are in the textbook. You can definitely argue for either side. There are some cases where genetic testing makes a lot of sense, and it is actually some is required in some cases. Like for the PKU, it's required because there's, nutritional things that you can do to prevent it. But there are also, a lot of arguments on the other side against genetic testing. So just make sure that you're presenting kind of a balanced argument, that you're supporting what you are saying with facts and backing it up with things that you've seen in the videos or things that are in the textbook. And then Chapter 4 is just about prenatal development. This is the things about the nutrition, and it goes through this different prenatal stages of exactly how the fetus develops. There are some really amazing things that you'll find out in this chapter. The videos are, well, some of them are optional, the ones that show like the actual live birth, but I think they're pretty informative and interesting, and we're really looking at it in a scientific kind of way. So your choice though. And then it goes through things about like low birth weight and problems in pregnancy and ways that you can encourage a healthy pregnancy. So make sure to watch those videos and read Chapter 4 about pregnancy and birth. So that is it for the Unit 1 overview. Like I said, that's not a comprehensive, all-inclusive type of thing. There's definitely a lot of information that I did not cover. So make sure to read all of your chapter and watch all of the videos.